Masechet Nedarim Daf Kaf Vav. Our Mishnah that we saw yesterday was talking about the category of Nidre Shegaga. You make a neder, but it's an error. You didn't realize that this wasn't true, and you made a vow about it. The last example of the Mishnah is what we're focusing on. It's where someone's looking out at his garden and he sees a bunch of people eating figs, and he's not happy with that. And so he says, these figs are prohibited to all of you like a korban. But then he recognizes that one of the people is his father, and he never meant for his father to be prohibited. And so he says, oh, I don't mean my father, except for my father. So now, once he changed his formula, what do we say about the rest of the people? This, in the Mishnah, is a machloket, Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel. Beth Shammai says that everyone is still prohibited except for the father. In other words, he's just modifying what he meant by the vow, right? It was a mistake when he said everybody's prohibited. He didn't mean it to cover his father, had he known one of them was his father. But the vow is still applies to all the others. He just made a quick clarification when he said, I didn't accept the father. Beth Hillel, however, says that everyone is permitted because, as the Gemara explains, a partial cancel is a full cancel. Once you cancel part of a vow, then the whole thing. So once you make an exception and say, oh, this doesn't apply, I didn't want it to apply to my father, well then the whole thing does not apply at all, and therefore there is no more vow, and all the people are permitted to eat the figs. That is what the Mishnah said. Now the Gemara yesterday brought two interpretations, one of Rabbah and one of Rava. Rabbah, third generation, Rava, his student in the fourth generation. And they say two different things. Rabbah says this machloket is limited to one specific case, where one says a general formulation and then individual. But if in general to general, then it's prohibited by all. What do I mean by these terms? Let me go back and to remind us what they are. So there's two types of formulations one can take. Either kulchem asurin chutz me'aba, you're all prohibited from my figs except for father. That's a general. Individuals, if I say Mr. A, Mr. B, you are prohibited, but my father, he is permitted. That would be an individual. He's naming each individual is prohibited. So Rabbah says it depends on what he says when we ask him. Listen, at first you said a general thing, all of you are prohibited, but then you realized your father was there. What would you have said? In other words, what's your modification of your statement? If he says a general formula again, in other words, he says, well, you know what I meant to say? What I would have said is, you're all prohibited except for father. Well, in that case, you're not really changing the formula. You said a general one before, and you're still continuing with the general one. You just add an exception. So Rabbah says everyone would agree, even Beth Hillel, that everyone else is prohibited, because that's not a new formulation. You're just continuing. However, if first he said a general formulation, you're all prohibited, and then they ask him, oh, you realize your father is there, what would you have said? Oh, I would have said Mr. A, Mr. B are prohibited, but father is permitted. Oh, in that case now, this is a change in the exact formula. So only here is there machloket. Beth Shammai would say it's still prohibited because, you're just clarifying what you said before. The same people are prohibited before, except for father. So those people also remain prohibited. But Beth Hillel would say, oh, you changed your formula from general to individual. Since you changed fundamentally the formula, now the whole neder is done. Once you partial cancel is a full cancel. That is Rabbah's interpretation. And in this interpretation, in more cases, they would all agree that's prohibited. Half the cases they would agree it's prohibited, and only in half the cases is there a machloket. Rava, however, interprets the machloket differently towards much more permission. According to him, in half the cases, everyone agrees it's permitted, and only in half the cases is there a machloket. So Rava says as follows: if he changes the formula from general to individual, right, and the second time says, what would you have said? Oh, I would have said Mr. A, Mr. B are prohibited, but father is permitted. No, if he says that, then he's changing the formula. Everyone would agree, even Beth Shammai, that it's permitted. Whereas if he says general to general, he says, first he said, oh, you're all prohibited. Then he says, well, what I would have said is, you're all prohibited except for a father. In that case, Beth Shammai would say prohibited. and Beth Hillel would say permitted. Beth Shammai would say permitted because any change, any cancel of partial is cancel of the whole thing. Beth Shammai would still say prohibited because Beth Shammai in here would say prohibited because you're not changing at all the formula, unlike this one. You're still saying a general formula, but just adding an exception. So this is a continuation. Really, the first language is what you meant. And the second one is just a continuation and explaining what you meant by the first formulation, and that's why it's prohibited. The last point we said about the Mishnah is this one, that according to Beth Shammai, he would agree with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, in a different context, says Tefos Lashon Rishon. You always follow the original formulation, and so here too, the original formulation was general, and if it remains a general, but you just say you're all prohibited except for father, so that's just a clarification of the first statement, and it's a continuation of the same vow. So the father is allowed, but everyone else is prohibited, according to Beth Shammai. Okay, that was the machloket that we saw between Rabbah and Rava. What we're going to do today is we're going to test out this machloket and ask a question from a Mishnah on Daf 66. That Mishnah has two parts. We're going to ask from the first part, and then we're going to end the Daf by asking from the second part regarding onions. Okay, but we start with the first part, and here it is. So we're up to the Mishnah, this challenge here. Itibe Rav Papa le Rava. Rav Papa is next fifth generation. His teacher is Rava, and he's asking Rava a question. So this challenge will be told to Rava only, not to Rabbah. All right, first we're going to introduce the Mishnah on 66, and then we'll see how it applies and how it's a question. Kesad amar Rabbi Akiva neder shehutar miksato hutar kulo. Rabbi Akiva, he's the one that said that if part of a vow is annulled, then the entire vow is annulled. What's an example that Rabbi Akiva would say such a thing? If one said, Kunam sheni nehene lekulechem, it could be the same case of the figs. And this person said, you're all prohibited. Or in this case, actually, it's different. He says, I will not benefit from any of you. Okay, or whatever the case is. He's angry at them. I will not benefit from any of you. But then one of them becomes permitted. For example, let's say he realized that his father is in the crowd, and he never meant to make a prohibition for benefiting from his father. And so he said, well, that was a mistake. And so, shegaga, fine. So it doesn't apply to his father. But what about everybody else? Huteru kulam, then they are all permitted. Okay, that's case number one. However, if he says, she'eni nehene lo lazeh ve'lazeh, here he uses an individual format, and he says, I am not going to benefit from Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C. In that case, hutar harishon huteru kulam. If that first one mentioned was his father, then all the rest of them down the list will all be permitted. But hutar acharon, if his father happened to be the last one on the list, acharon mutar vechulan asurim. Only the last one is permitted, and the rest of them remain prohibited. Okay, we're going to get to the distinction between these two points in the answer to the question, but for now, let's just summarize this Mishnah as follows. If he says a general formula, then once one is permitted, they're all permitted. If he says an individual formula, then even if one becomes permitted, the first ones or the ones before him are still prohibited. At least some of them are still prohibited, right? So that was the Mishnah there. It made a distinction between Kondam Sheni Lekulechem, a general formula, where for sure everyone else is permitted, whereas in an individual formula, at least in some cases, the rest will remain prohibited. All right, that's all the Mishnah said over there. Now, what the Mishnah there is missing is, what is the case? What was his original formula? And what would he have changed it to, right? Remember, Rava added this whole layer of complication that it depends. The Mishnah up above here also doesn't have two layers of what did you say and what did you mean. It just says what did you say. Nevertheless, Rabbah and Rava make this distinction between, wait a second, depends on a general individual formula. Once they added that distinction in the Mishnah on our daf, so we're going to apply the same distinction over there to the Mishnah in 66. And so the question is, what is the case here? Right? We're assuming that the general and individual are their original formulations, and if so, what would be their subsequent reformulation? And how would you get the permitted case and the prohibited verdict in each one of them? So let's try it for each one. We start with Rabbah. Shelemah Rabbah. This is all part of the Papa's question to Rabbah. Right? According to Rabbah, everything makes sense. Mokim la l'resha damar ze la ze. He'll say the first case in that Mishnah is when he changes from a general formula, that's what he said, and he switches over to an individual formula. This is what I would have said is, each A and B and C are prohibited except for father. So that will be a general to individual. Well, what did Rabbah say about that case? Rabbah said general to individual is permitted according to Beth Hillel. Well, that's fine. Beth Hillel, this Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva, who says also once part is permitted, the whole thing is permitted. Right? That was Beth Hillel's opinion as well. And so this Mishnah here is following Beth Hillel, right? Because it says that it's talking about Rabbi Akiva, who has the same principle as Beth Hillel. So Rabbah is totally fine. General, by explaining when the Mishnah in 66 says a general is permitted, a general formulation, what he means is that if you said a general and you switched it to an individual, I know the Mishnah here, there doesn't say anything about what the subsequent thought was, but it's left open, so Rabbah can say it's general to individual, and that is permitted because that is Beth Hillel's opinion. And what about the Sefa, where he said individual first? Well, let's see. Sefa damar lekulchem. Sefa is when his reformulation is general, right? So in the Sefa here he talked about individuals first, and then right, you and you and you, right, are all prohibited. And then we didn't realize one of them was his father. He said you're all prohibited except for father. Now we didn't actually have this exact case before, because before they were all generals to something else. But here, presumably, the general is more inclusive than each individual, and so therefore, if general to general is prohibited, then individual to general would also be prohibited, right? Because he's now saying everything I said before, as being all inclusive, are all prohibited. So that would include all the prohibited people before, and then just says except for father. So that would remain prohibited, even according to Beth Hillel. And so you see that Rabbah can explain everything very well. Let me just take a moment to say this whole argument, this daf is very complicated, and the commentaries here go in all kinds of directions trying to explain it. I think this is a most straightforward explanation, but you can look at the Ran and others for other possibilities. Okay, so this we can explain this Mishnah according to Rabbah. Here's the problem. According to Rava, let me just tell you in general what we're going to expect. You see, Rava says that according to Beth Hillel, all possibilities are permitted, right? Whether you go from general to individual or general to general, Beth Hillel says this is permitted according to everyone, and this is permitted according to Beth Hillel. So here, when we get to Mishnah 66, there is a case of something prohibited. Well, there is no case of something prohibited according to Beth Hillel. So how is Rava going to explain that Mishnah? That's basically what we're coming to. So this is Rav Papa is continuing. Ela ledidach, for you, my teacher Rava. We can explain that Resha is where he said to everyone. Originally he said general, and now he's saying another general formulation. First he said, I'm prohibited in benefit from all of you. When he realized it was father, he said, I'm prohibited to benefit from all of you except for father. So in that case, general to general, Beth Hillel permits. So that's totally fine. We can explain this Mishnah. But what about the second case where it talks about an individual? Ela sefa de amar lazeh ve'lazeh, where it is an individual formulation, Rabbi Akiva hi, and we know this Mishnah says, is the author is Rabbi Akiva, amai peligi rabbanan aleh, v'amar divrei hakol mutar. Why are you saying that the rabbis disagree with him? Didn't you say that according to everyone, Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai, everyone says it's permitted, right? So here the second case is where is something about an individual. But Rava, you said that when you're talking about a general to an individual statement, it's going to be permitted according to everyone. So what are you going to say? This is talking about a case of general to individual or individual to general? That will still be permitted according to Beth Hillel. So what case would be prohibited for Beth Hillel? Rava, how can you explain the sefa of this Mishnah? All right, this seems like a really good question. Let's see how Rava is going to get out of this. Amar le Rava, ul Rabbah, Rabbi Akiva, mi nicha sefa. Hold on. Rava says, I'll turn the question around to you, Rabbah, right? And say, according to Rabbi Akiva, can you really explain the sefa well? B'may mokim la damar lekulechem. You said it's talking about a case of general. Heden hu rishon veheden hu acharon. But which is first and which is last? Remember, in that Mishnah, right, which you said is talking about individual to general, and that's why it's prohibited, because that'll be even more general to general, so it'll be prohibited to all, and even Bet Shammai. That's what you said. But remember what the exact wording of that Mishnah was. Let me go back and show you. The wording of the Mishnah was, if the first person on the list was permitted, then everyone on the list is permitted. So actually, they're all permitted in such a case, and only if he's the last one, then only the last one is permitted and the rest are prohibited. But according to you, we didn't see any such distinction beforehand between if it's first, who's the first, who's the last. What are you talking about, right? In the case of the previous Mishnah, where the case that you said was prohibited according to Beth Shammai, he just says a general formulation and then another general formulation. But this is not a general and general formulation. So according to you, how can you say that it depends on some individual? Rather, Rava said this is talking about individual and then general, right? So everyone is prohibited. Who's mentioned first? Who's mentioned last? Sorry, Rabbah, but you yourself did not sufficiently explain the second case of Mishnah 66. So don't put the question on me, you answer it. And I'll tell you what it does mean and why this is different from all the cases we saw before in Mishnah here in Nedarim. Which is first and which is last? Ela. Rava says, I can explain everything. The Resha is where he used a general formulation. The Sefa is when he used a chain formulation, which we didn't have before. Before it was just individuals, but not that each individual is dependent on the one before. Rather, he says, he depends each one upon the next. And he says, A should be like B, B should be like A, C should be like B, D should be like C. And that's why each prohibition of the next person is dependent on the one before. So here's the summary. Rava would say that the first case of the general, is general to general, and that is permitted, right, according to Beth Hillel. That's no problem. The second case is not what you said, Rabbah, where at first he said Mr. A is prohibited, Mr. B is prohibited, Mr. C is prohibited. No, it's talking about where he used a chain formulation. He looks at this guy, he says, Mr. A, you are prohibited to me like korban. And then he says, Mr. B is like Mr. A. Mr. C is like B. D is like C. In that case, he realizes that one of them is his father. Well, if he realized that Mr. D is his father, well, then all the rest of them remain the same. Because, okay, you just chop off the end of the formula, but the rest of the formula still applies. Whereas, if A was his father, and so he never meant to prohibit A, he only said B is like A, but A is his father is permitted. So then B is permitted, then C is, and D is permitted as well. So this is talking about a totally different case altogether, and that's why, according to Rava, It is this is why there is, first of all, a permission. If it ends up being A, they're all permitted because the original vow never applied to anyone. But if the father is the last one, then the original formula does apply to each and every one of them. So that's how Rava explains that Mishnah, and it's all good. And in fact, Rava Gemara adds that this explanation of Rava is correct. It's talking about a chain formula. Daikaname detanya, we have a Baraita parallel to our Mishnah that says Hutada emsa'i hemenu Hutada emsa'i hemenu ulmata mutarin ulmala asurin. If someone in the middle was permitted, Mr. B or C, what turned out to be his father, then anyone from then on to the end of the sentence is permitted, but anyone before that person, closer to their first prohibition, would remain prohibited. So you see, this Braita obviously means it's talking about a chain formula. So Rava was able to extricate himself from the problem and explain it. Okay, good. That was the first case in that Mishnah. And now we get to the second case in Mishnah, also 166, regarding the onions. This is also addressed as a question to Rava, although we're going to see it is also a challenge to Rabbah. Okay, let's see what this case is. Kunam basar shani to'em shabasar lalev. Someone says, onions are prohibited to me because onions are bad for the heart. He read some article that said onions are bad for you, so he made a vow against onions. But then someone told him after, no, that doesn't apply to all onions. Some onions are bad for your heart, but the ones from the villages, from Kufri, those are actually good for your heart. So he made an error. He made a vow in error for part of his vow. Hutar bekufri. In that case, I never meant to prohibit myself from onions that are good for me. So in that case, he's permitted certainly to eat the village onions. And not only that, he's actually allowed not only in the village onions, but in all onions. We're applying the principle that once part of it is undone, then the whole thing is undone. And there was a real case where Rabbi Meir himself permitted all onions. Now this is going to come up again because Rabbi Meir was the one before that we said agreed with Beth Shammai, who is stringent in this matter. Okay, that is the Mishnah. Now, what is the case? My love damar, ilu hayiti yodea shakufri yafel alev, hayiti omer kol habesarim asurin vekufri mutar. Isn't this a case where you're talking about a general formula to a general formula, where first he said all onions are prohibited, and then he said, had I known that the village onions are prohibited, I would have said all onions are prohibited, but kufri is, the village onions are prohibited. So it's talking about a general to a general, and that's why it's prohibited. Now, remember, this is a Rabbi Meir who follows Beth Shammai. So let's see, who could explain this Mishnah according to Beth Shammai now? Let's see. Rava, he said general to general is prohibited according to everyone. So actually, this Mishnah is a big problem to Rabbah, because if indeed Rabbi Meir is following Beth Shammai, as we saw at the end of the previous stuff, then this case of the onions to onions would be prohibited to Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai. So Rabbah is going to have a hard time explaining this Mishnah. But Rava also, even though he's generally more permissive, will also have a hard time, because if it's talking about a general formulation to general formulation, all onions are prohibited, then he says, I meant to say all onions except for village onions. That is permitted only calling Beth Hillel, but here's a machloket, and Beth Shammai would prohibit. So in other words, both Rabbah and Rava would say a general to general formulation is prohibited according to Beth Shammai, and Beth Shammai is the author, and Rabbi Meir, who we said follows Beth Shammai, is the author of our Mishnah. So how could anyone explain it? And we answer, Lo be'omer ilo hayiti yodea shekufri yafeh laleb, hayiti omer basal peloni, upeloni asurim, vekufri mutar. No, this is talking about a case where first he said all onions are prohibited, but then someone told him that village onions are healthy, so then they said, what would you have said had you known that to begin with? Oh, he says, then I would have said that this type of onion is prohibited, and second type of onion is prohibited to me, but village onions are permitted. He would have said an individual formula. Oh, in that case, Rabbi Meir, according to Rabbi Akiva, perhaps not in his own opinion, because Rabbi Meir may in his own opinion follow Beth Shammai, but Rabbi Meir, in the opinion of his teacher Rabbi Akiva, and in the opinion of the rest of the rabbis, he would say permitted. Okay, and this will solve the problem according to everyone. So if it's in general to individual, well, Rava for sure, that's easy. A general to individual is permitted according to everyone, Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai. So Rava will actually have a very easy time explaining that Mishnah about the onions. Now it's a little bit more difficult for Rabbah because he says a general to individual, and that's how we're saying what this case is, where he named the individual species of onions that are prohibited, and in the second his second reformulation. In that case, actually, only according to Beth Hillel, it would be permitted. According to Beth Shammai, it would be prohibited. So how can Rabbi Meir here says that it's permitted? So he would have to say, Rabbah would have to say that Rabbi Meir here was not talking about his own opinion, according to Beth Shammai, but rather he was speaking according to the opinion of his teacher, Rabbi Akiva, who followed the sages who said that once a part of it is permitted, then the whole neder is permitted. So this is very interesting, whereas Rabbah had a much easier time explaining the first Mishnah, and it was a challenge to Rava, although Rava very successfully defended himself because there was in fact talking about a chain tradition. In this case, Rava has a much easier time explaining it, whereas Rabbah has to say, no, Rabbi Meir was not talking about his own opinion, but only about Rabbi Akiva's opinion. But in the end, we explained both Mishnayot according to both interpretations of Rabbah and Rava. Let's continue on till we get to the next Mishnah so we can finish off this topic. And we have now two more challenges from other sources. Iti be Ravina le Rava. Now Ravina asks a question to Rava's opinion. Rabbi Natan Omer, Yesh neder shemiksato mutar umiksato asur. Rabbi Natan says there is a case that's following where someone makes a vow, and then some of it is a mistake, and part of the vow is permitted, and part of it remains prohibited. What's the case? Kesad. Nadar mina kalkala. He sees a basket of fruit. He's an actual painting of a basket of fruit from Roman times. And he says, this basket is prohibited to me. But then he's looking in the basket and he sees there are these benot shuach figs, which are really, really good figs, the best, most delicious figs. And he says, I didn't realize there was these very fine figs. I would never have made a vow if I knew that those figs were in there. I really want to eat them. In that case, that's a mistaken vow. Hakalkala asura benot mutarot, and the whole basket remains prohibited. It doesn't undo the whole vow, but the benot shuach figs would be permitted. That's the opinion of the rabbis. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva v'limed neder shutar miksato v'utar kulo, until Rabbi Akiva came and he taught this principle that a vow that is partially dissolved, the whole thing is dissolved. We see in this source from the Rabbi Natan that there's a machloket between the rabbis. Now, who's the rabbis? It is in fact Rabbi Meir, who follows the opinion of Beth Shammai. Right? He's the one that is more prohibitive and does not agree with this principle of Rabbi Akiva. So the rabbis / Rabbi Meir / Beth Shammai say it's prohibited, and Rabbi Akiva say the whole basket is permitted. All right, now let's see. What kind of case is he talking about? Now we're going to add the second layer. All right, what formulation? When we ask you, what would you have said? What is his reformulation? My lav damar ilu hayiti ondea shebenot shuach betocha hayiti omer tenim shechorot banot asurot benot shuach mutarot v'Rabbi Akivahi upeligi rabanan. Is it not that the second formulation is, if I had known that there were these nice figs in there, I would have said that the figs, the white figs, are prohibited. The black figs are prohibited, but the benot shuach figs, those are permitted. In other words, an individual formula. So is it not a case of general to individual? And it's Rabbi Akiva is the only one that permitted, but the rest of the rabbis would prohibit. Well, let's see. What would Rava say about such a case? General to individual. General to individual, Rava actually says that's permitted according to everyone. And so that can't be, that's a problem, this source for Rava. Since it's permitted according to everybody, then how come the Rabbanan said prohibited in such a case? No one says prohibited in general to individual. And Rava has a simple answer. He's going to say, no, this is talking about general to general. And that's exactly why there's a machloket. Rabbi Akiva and Beth Hillel say prohibited, but the Rabbanan, represented by Rabbi Meir, following Beth Shammai, they all say prohibited. The rest of the fruit basket is prohibited. So he has an easy answer. That's what he's going to say. Lo be'omer ilo hayiti yodea shebenot shuach betocha hayiti omer kol ha'kalkala asura ubenot shuach mutarot. His reformulation is, if I had known that there were these benot shuach figs, I would have said the whole thing is prohibited except for benot shuach. I want to make sure to eat those, since that's general to general. That is, in fact, where the machloket is. Rava has no problem with that source. Last source. Man tana leha. Who could be the author of this? The Tanu Rabbanan. Nadar mehamisha b'nei adam ke'achad. Hutar le'achad mehen huteru kulan. Chutz me'achad mehen hu mutar vehen asurin. If a person made a vow from deriving any benefit from 5 people, but he said it in one utterance, meaning individually, he said, Mr. A, Mr. B, C, and D, E are all prohibited to me. He said individual formula. Then, if one of them is permitted, one of them is his father, and he didn't realize, then all of them are permitted. However, if he says, Chutz me'echad mehen, this sounds like a general formula. He says, all of you are prohibited. And then he realizes one of them is his father. He says, all of you are prohibited except for my father. Then, hu mutar vehen asurin, the father is permitted, but the rest of them remain prohibited. The vow stays in place. So in other words, when we have a general to individual, it's permitted. A general to general is prohibited. So who would be the author of this baraita? We can explain it both according to Rabbah and according to Rava as follows. Id Rabbah, Resha Rabbi Akiva, Sefa Dibre Hakol. The Resha is only the opinion of Rabbi Akiva / Beth Hillel. And the Sefa would be the opinion of everyone. Let's compare that to our chart. So again, if it's general to individual, then it's permitted. So let's see here. Rabbah says general to individual would be permitted, and that would be only according to Beth Hillel. So that's why he says the Resha is only Rabbi Akiva. Whereas the Sefa that says general to general is prohibited according to all, so the Sefa could be the opinion of everyone. Right? Sefa divrei hakol. I Rava Sefa Rabbanan v'Resha divrei hakol. According to Rava, the Sefa could be the opinion of everyone, the opinion of Rabbanan only. Rabbanan here means Rabbi Meir / Beth Shammai, and the Resha could be the opinion of everyone. So let's see that again. The Resha here was when he talks about general to individual. So general to individual is permitted according to everyone. So that could be the opinion of everyone. Whereas the Sefa, which is general to general, and this baraita says prohibited, well, that would have to be only the opinion of Beth Shammai / Rabbi Meir / Rabbanan. And so both Rabbah and Rava can explain this Mishnah, although each one of them will have to say that one part or the other is everyone's opinion, and one part is only the opinion of one party. And so we explained all of the sources according to Rabbah and according to Rava, and that concludes this discussion. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen v'Amen.